by the same token, he was opposed to the Gang of Four and the near zero nukes plan that, voiced by Kissinger, Schultz, Sam Nunn, and William Perry, is naive and simple-minded since it's relatively easy to make nuclear weapons, and therefore he thought that the United States needed a modest stockpile so as to maintain a minimal deterrence. Finally, there is his business expertise. His family background, consulting after the Ford administration, first with International Six Incorporated, then his own firm, and he was co-founder of Kissinger Associates in 1980, and of course the Scowcroft Group in 1994. And several told me that the Scowcroft Group is the most prestigious and influential of the several Washington area international business consulting groups. For all his loyalty, work ethic, integrity, and multivocality, there's something else that's crucial: his good humor. He played practical jokes, wrote silly or naughty comments on memos, and laughs a lot. He is a cordial, affable man who treats others well. You get a lot more from your staff by treating them well, he told me. Although he and Dick Cheney fell out in 2001 and have remained estranged, when they were both in the Ford administration, they were very good friends, and Scowcroft's successor as White House military assistant called Scowcroft and Cheney the White House's two most loved men. Richard Haas, who headed the Middle East desk on the NSC staff under Bush 41 and is now president of the Council of Foreign Relations, has commented that the Bush administration was the most collegial of any of the four administrations in which he had served. Working there was actually a lot of fun, he said. It sounds bizarre, but it was by far the most enjoyable experience a lot of us have had before or since in government. There was a lot of camaraderie and kidding around. It was very relaxed. And make no mistakes, there was also an immense amount of work, and he talked about the hours he had to put in, and at one time he was going to go home, and Scowcroft said, nope, you have something else to do. So it's not like that he wouldn't burden and didn't have a lot of responsibility. It was just he enjoyed his time there and was willing to spend that time. What, you might ask, about Scowcroft's famous propensity for falling asleep and then waking up as though nothing had happened, a capacity for which President Bush created the famous Scowcroft Award. He would get up at 4:45 in the morning and go to bed after midnight, after a run, after the 11 o'clock evening news. What most don't appreciate, though, is he had to go home during the day to take care of his ill wife in the late 80s and 90s, as well as doing so in the first thing early in the day and on the weekends. And it was, I suspect it was, and I've been told it was President Bush's knowledge of his dedication and of Jackie's personal situation as the reason why he never seemed to mind Brent falling asleep and then waking up in the middle of meetings. I would be remiss not to bring up two larger points. One is the end of the Cold War, where Scowcroft conceded that his own life had been wholly oriented around the Cold War and that the Bush administration did not offer an alternative future for Americans in the world. In the words of one journalist, future historians will find it hard to understand why the United States, with the world at its feet, did not seize the opportunity itself had created to install a new world order. The Bush administration did propose a new world order, of course, a slogan and set of ideas first proposed in the fall of 1990, shortly after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, but for all sorts of reasons, it could not be sustained. I think this is in part true, but any judgment of the Bush administration's failure to outline an overarching vision of U.S. grand strategy post-Cold War needs to be tempered by the fact of how fast everything was changing. It's easy to forget the vastness of the perceived political, economic, cultural, and ideological gulf that separated the United States and the Soviet Union, and the fear and suspicion both sides felt about each other. And it's easy to forget, again, how fast everything transformed. When I was in graduate school at the time, it was just absolutely amazing how quickly things were changing. Scowcroft acknowledged that the sheer pace of events was overwhelming at times. The Bush White House did all it could simply to keep on top of things, Scowcroft said. There was a lot to digest. He conceded that the administration didn't have a comprehensive strategy for a world that was moving at a rapid pace. Events were happening too soon. President Bush, James Baker, and Scowcroft, and others in the White House and the government didn't have the time to find our feet. We were just trying to keep up with things, he said. The fact is, as Scowcroft admitted, the Bush administration didn't have any great ideas about the direction the world was going to go. We were sort of battling around all the ideas. What was the world going to be like? Would we be able to cooperate with the Soviet Union? What was going to happen in China? Was China falling apart? There's a really wide-ranging discussion about what the future might look like. It's all fuzzy other than the New World Order, which he later told me, and this is, I think, partly post hoc, I wish I never thought of. All the same, I think under the circumstances, it's unrealistic perhaps to expect the Bush administration and Washington policy community to assimilate all that had happened in such a relatively short period, especially one that was that concluded just before the last year of his office and the beginning of the re-election campaign. Scowcroft himself described the administration as being in limbo until re-election. By comparison, consider the 8 years that elapsed between the end of the Revolutionary War and the ratification of the Constitution, or the nearly 5 years that passed between the end of World War II and the emergence of the U.S. policy consensus on the nature of the Soviet threat and the need to contain global communism as articulated in NSC 68 in April 1950. When we consider how threatening and how all-encompassing the Cold War was, I don't think these are specious parallels. Maybe you can say we run out of time or we ran out of gas, Arnold Cantor said, but the one-term Bush presidency may have been too brief a period to fully assess how the United States would reorient itself in a transformed world. So the United States muddled through the Clinton years and the first 8 months of the George Bush administration until national security achieved a new focus. The second topic is Scowcroft's position on the Second Iraq War. And the bird here seems to be sort of a small eagle and carrying a little olive branch, where the younger George Bush ignored Scowcroft's several warnings about attacking Iraq in the Washington Post, in foreign newspaper op-eds, and several times on national television. But it was a Wall Street Journal op-ed on August 15, 2002, the editorial page of which is virtually a bulletin board for the Republican Party, that created the great controversy. In the op-ed, Scowcroft wrote, this is an adaptation of remarks he'd given on Meet the Press on Sunday, August 4th, any campaign against Iraq, whatever the strategy, costs, and risks, is certain to divert us for some indefinite period from our war on terrorism. Worse, there is a virtual consensus in the world against an attack on Iraq at this time. So as long as that sentiment persists, it would require the U.S. to pursue a virtual go-it-alone strategy against Iraq, making any military operations correspondingly more difficult and expensive. The most serious cost, however, would be to the war on terrorism. Ignoring that clear sentiment would result in a serious degradation in international cooperation with us against terrorism. Possibly the most dire consequence, Scowcroft continued, would be the effect in the region, for if the United States was seen to be turning its back on the bitter Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to go against Iraq, there would be an explosion of outrage against us. We would be seen as ignoring a key interest of the Muslim world in order to satisfy what is seen to be a narrow American interest. Even without Israeli involvement, the results could well stabilize Arab regimes in the region, ironically facilitating one of Saddam's strategic objectives. You know the unhappy, unfortunate rest. The irony is not only was Scowcroft the chief initiator of the first Gulf War, arguably a war of necessity to restore the status quo ante bellum, but the first Bush administration, like the second, had not planned for the end game well, that it considered what would happen once the United States and Allied forces repelled the Iraqi military from Kuwait. Yet despite being a persona non grata for officials in the second Bush administration, he stayed in touch, kept in touch with Condoleezza Rice and Stephen Hadley, and in 2007 came out in support of the surge. Again, he detached his ego, his frustration, and the unpleasantness of being vilified by White House supporters, Republican surrogates, and neoconservatives after his Wall Street Journal op-ed, and considered what the United States needed to do given its circumstances at the end of 2006. As Elliot Abrams told me in an interview, George W. Bush's advisors and the Republicans more generally didn't appreciate that Scowcroft's loyalty to the United States was more important to him than his loyalty to the Republican Party or even to the Bush family. Out of office, Scowcroft and his former advisors and friends established the Forum for International Policy, a think tank that morphed into the Scowcroft Group. Besides consulting, which took up most of his time, he gave speeches, granted interviews, served on presidential commissions. most recently one on nuclear energy and nuclear waste, and continued to weigh in on foreign policy, sometimes with op-eds, more usually in private conversations, including, it seems, with the current president, as Jeffrey Goldberg has recently written in The Atlantic. Scowcroft's career acquired another dimension as well as he aged. He started achieving prestigious awards. He said he is proudest of the receipt of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in July 1991 and the award of the insignia of the Honorary Knight of the British Empire from Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace in 1993. But these are only two of many. Others have included the Eisenhower Institute's Eisenhower Leadership Prize from Gettysburg College, the Hudson Institute's James Doolittle Award, the Les Aspen Democracy Award from Marquette University, the Association of the U.S. Army's George Catlin Marshall Medal, and the Andrew Wellington Cordier Award from Columbia University for superior and distinguished public service. He received the William Oliver Baker Award for service on behalf of the U.S. intelligence community, the Andrew Goodpaster Award for his exemplary service to the nation in 2008, the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, and he was elected into the National Defense University's National Hall of Fame, and in April that year, he received the Gerald R. Ford Foundation's Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and this is in 2013, and then there are others. I mention these several prizes because while many retired generals, admirals, statesmen, and policy advisors, politicians, and diplomats receive awards as they age, what is extraordinary about Scowcroft's prizes is not just the large number, but how prestigious the prizes are and how varied the bestowing organizations and indeed the countries are giving him the awards. The awards reflect the almost universal respect others have for him and the desire of many people have had to recognize the scale of Scowcroft's achievements and the quality of his contributions to public service. This public service continues. When former President Bush established the Bush Presidential Library and the Texas A&M Regents that created the Bush School of Government and Public Service, they also wanted to establish an affiliated research institute. The Scowcroft Institute opened on November 10, 2007, and Scowcroft himself endowed it with funds for scholarship, administrative support, a number of grants, and putting on a major annual conference, and a chaired faculty position. As importantly, he helped find other donors to the Bush School. Previously, he had helped fund a scholarship for West Point cadets in 2000, the Government Internships Endowment, which allowed West Point to underwrite cultural and professional immersion for 30 to 50 cadets to be placed in the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the White House, and other departments and agencies of the U.S. government. General Daniel Kritzman, a former superintendent at West Point, said Scowcroft felt so strongly about the necessity of young officers to have this identification with other religions, cultures, languages. Scowcroft also funded the Arnold Cantor Chair at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security in 2006 and established a paid internship program at the Atlantic Strategy Group for selecting 4 outstanding college graduates interested in working on national security issues. And in 2009, he established and endowed the Brent Scowcroft Professorship in National Security Studies within the Eisenhower Center for Space and Defense Studies in the Department of Political Science at the U.S. Air Force Academy. These I mention because the general is very modest and not self-promoting, but he should nonetheless be recognized for his philanthropy. In a highly competitive world where everyone wants to toot his horn, Scowcroft's late friend Bill Gully says, Scowcroft is the last to do that. To understand Brent Scowcroft, you have to understand his humanity, said Daniel Poneman, a former NSC colleague and former partner in the Scowcroft Group and a personal friend. Not just his intellect, not even just his judgment, but his humanity. It's a genuine humanity that respects other individuals as individuals. He knows exactly who he is, and he is very comfortable with who he is. He feels fortunate to have had things happen to him that he could never dreamed of as a kid growing up in Utah, as one of his friends and colleagues said. And what he told me, and he's never forgotten that kid from Ogden. So what do we take from this biographical sketch? And what is his worldview post 9/11? Not that it is necessarily changed from before those events. And it is on this point that I'll end. It is a vision of a world shaped by open markets, of U.S. leadership, and of a cooperative international system bending towards democracy and human rights. It rests on an underlying philosophy of old-fashioned Burkean conservatism, cognizant of human dignity, protective of private property, and skeptical about ambitious plans for human progress, while nonetheless assuming that political leaders are capable of reasoned negotiation and intelligent cooperation. Hence his emphasis on rigorous discussion in the NSC meetings and his faith that his conversations and writings, and his faith that conversations and writings with those in and outside government are able to persuade presidents and their advisors of alternative options. And here, Scowcroft has been superb at straddling the life of a military officer and strategic expert with classification ratings and covert action, protecting the interests of the United States in a hostile world, and life as a policy advisor, where the United States as a democracy is governed by its citizens through their elected representatives and informed by a free press. This is a sphere that values consultation, open debate, due process, and consensus building. Whereas Scowcroft's national security involves the medium and longer term, the public and democratic world is dominated by short-term considerations, especially the prospects for the next round of elections. And Scowcroft's genius, I think, has been able to have his tremendous accomplishments while being in this middle ground where these two spheres coincide and often collide, and he's been just extraordinarily successful at reconciling the tensions between the two. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take that. Sure.
You describe General Scowcroft's ancestors as sort of the noble families of the Mormon Church, I mean, which I did not realize. Do you think that that history had any effect on his worldview? Did Mormon theology affect how he conducted himself? And what were those effects? What were those consequences?
Yeah, I think I see the effects in a few ways, besides kind of his security about who he was and his background, and I think having this confidence and faith in the United States as a nation, and this is a destiny for Mormons in Scotland and England and indeed around the world. So I think one is kind of this a certain patriotism. Two, the theology is, I mean, Mormonism is very collective. Mormons take care of themselves, and maybe they're not. They tend to be Republican, but if you're a Mormon and you're a Mormon in good standing, you're taken care of with your education and health, and it's a very warm community. So I think I think this informed his both kind of how he runs his firms. One of the points I make in the book is that how he ran ISI and Scowcroft Group was a much more egalitarian business model than what you typically see, certainly in law firms and certainly in other consulting groups. Now, how does it form his strategy? I think I'm not sure about that too much. I think maybe because of the heterogeneous origins of the Mormons, I think it made him, and he also toured Europe and the Near East as when he was at the National War College. I think it made him more aware globally. But a lot of this, I think, I would attribute to it's also his curiosity. I mean, Mormons went on missions and they're informed about the world, and so yes, I think it sensitized him. About whether it informed direct strategy, perhaps. I think, and maybe in terms of the optimistic view he had. I mean, he's kind of optimistic. He was kind of pessimistic that the world is flawed and ugly, and we want to keep avenues of communication open with even rogue states or hostile regimes. But nonetheless, that we could live together and that we could maybe nudge and bring people along. So yeah.
Thank you, Brent. That was a wonderful talk, and it's really just a wonderful book, as you've heard many people say, but it has the added advantage of being true. I want to ask you a little bit of a counterfactual, in a sense. We always talk about General Scowcroft as being the prime example of a national security advisor. When you look in the encyclopedia, there's a little picture of him under National Security Advisor, and he's the person that we hold up as the best exemplar of what that job can be. But in many ways, it was also not his first choice. He was, of course, President Bush's first choice to be National Security Advisor in 1988, 1989. But as I understand it, he would have rather at that point have gone to perhaps the Pentagon or even to the CIA. What does the Bush administration look like if he goes there? Who takes his place at the National Security Office? And would we wind up looking at General Scowcroft as the prime example of a Secretary of Defense had he actually gone to the Pentagon?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think what's absolutely crucial to what Stephen Halley was saying about the success of the Scowcroft model is how attuned President Bush was to foreign policy and his own background and expertise and his close friendship with Brent Scowcroft. So, and I think there's also Scowcroft's style. So I think, say he was Secretary of Defense, I still think he would have, because one of the things that happens when they're after the fall elections, fall '88 elections, Scowcroft and the president-elect spent a lot of time walking around the perimeter of Camp David thinking about how are they going to lay out their administration, who's going to be in which offices, how are the people going to relate to each other. Now, you can't know everybody, but they could pick a lot of the players. And they were very careful to make sure, as you heard this morning, that people were friends, that they were professionals. And remember, the people in that first Bush administration were all pretty senior. They're all pretty senior. They had already proved themselves. They didn't have anything to prove, and there wasn't kind of the maybe the sort of the there wasn't the youth or they were mature, and I think it was that course of that selection. So say they'd still had that picking and that selection and focus on personnel and the interdepartmental process. I think still Secretary of State, they would have said, okay, well, we're going to bring in. They thought about maybe a Larry Eagleburger or maybe Gates. They would have picked someone who would have fit in, would have been commensurate with that vision, and I think it would have been too different. I mean, there's certainly the friendship with Baker, and I think as Secretary of Defense, there still would have been that triumvirate, and maybe the National Security Advisor would have been a little bit more staff, because it's both staff, but also it's a principal in many ways, and I think maybe would have been maybe subsumed a little bit. So I think it wouldn't have been too different, but that's a great question. I think you're yeah.
Would you say something further about how you see the tremendous burden and love of Brent Scowcroft's private life and his wife's illness, and how it affected how he had to approach the total dimensions of all his life when he had that kind of responsibility driven by love, but nonetheless structuring most heavily a major portion of his adult life?
Yeah, no, that's, let me first give a disclaimer, and that is that I don't have any correspondence records, or not that there would have been too much correspondence, but also I didn't touch on that too heavily because Scowcroft is still with us and will be for a while, and so it was, and his family members and others either didn't know very much or were not willing to say very much, and so I didn't really have a particular insight on that relationship. And I can say that, like all things, he was incredibly stoic. He was just very stoic, very disciplined, very compartmentalized. And I think this allowed him to say, would be aware of it, and others occasionally would be aware that he had this, but he didn't want it getting out. And I think he just, this is all part of his I think his dedication and certainly his love. I mean, he dedicated the World Transformed that he wrote with the president to Jackie. So he was, it was amazing. In fact, at one point he talked about, at one point we were talked about sort of recent political scandals involving military officers and affairs, and he just really couldn't imagine, that was kind of beyond him, that you would have a Army generals behaving in ways that for him, his view seemed so indulgent or disloyal to their office and to the United States. So I think it was kind of just kind of who he is, and because they were so close, and he was clearly very devoted to her, and so this must have been just extraordinarily hard for him. And I think I don't want to say she enabled him, but clearly she was willing that he have these crazy hours. I mean, he's working just about every day in, say, 1974, 1975, and even under the Bush